I need to pause here because what is happening right now, people are experiencing the exact same thing right now in 2025. And the worst part, most of them don't even realize it yet. Before we go deeper into the darkness, I need to know you. Agree with me on this. Drop a comment, just one word. Tell me, hello, tell me you. We're following the signs. Tell me you see what is happening. Because the algorithm is designed to hide videos like this. YouTube doesn't want you seeing this. But if you comment, if you engage, if you hit that bell, you retelling the system that you need to know the truth. Comment hollow right now. Let me know you re-listening. Let me know you re-brave enough to keep going. The people in these next stories, they didn't comment. They didn't share. They didn't warn others. And that is exactly why they re-gone now. Story 1. Appalachian Watchtower. Lights that triggered a federal response. I saw them first on a Tuesday night, and by Thursday morning, federal agents had cordoned off a mountain. By Friday, everyone involved was either lying or dead. My name is Thomas Garrett. I work as an electrical lineman for a power company serving eastern Kentucky. I am 53 years old, divorced, and I've spent the last 27 years climbing towers and fixing electrical problems in the Appalachian Mountains. I thought I understood this region. I thought I knew what was possible here and what wasn't. I was catastrophically wrong. The lights appeared above Merrow Peak, one of the highest mountains in our service area. I noticed them because they interfered with the equipment I was monitoring. My job includes checking substations and transmission lines across 500 square miles of mostly rural territory. When something unusual happens to the electrical grid, I'm one of the people who has to investigate. The first observation wasn't too scary. It was just odd. On Tuesday night around 9 o'clock, I was reviewing data from our monitoring systems when I noticed a disturbance in the power readings from the Merrow Peak station. The voltage was fluctuating in patterns that didn't match any equipment failure I'd ever seen. The fluctuations were too regular, too intentional. I decided to drive up there the next morning and check the physical equipment. The road up Merrow Peak is narrow and poorly maintained. The forest on both sides is dense, mostly old-growth timber that hasn't been logged in decades. The canopy is so thick that even in the middle of the day, the road exists in a state of perpetual twilight. As I drove higher, I noticed something unsettling. There were no animals, no birds, no deer crossing the road. Just the sound of my truck engine and the creepy silence of a forest that had been abandoned by everything with a sense to leave. The substation sits on a cleared area near the peak, protected by a chain link fence that has been there since the 1970s. The equipment is old but functional. Solar panels have been added in recent years to help with power distribution in this remote area. When I arrived, I knew immediately that something was horrifying wrong. The fence had been cut. Not recently, not in a way that suggested theft or trespassing. The cuts were old. The edges weathered, the opening large enough for something big to pass through. But more terrifying was what I saw in the dirt inside the fence. There were footprints, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. All of them pointed toward the substation equipment, and all of them were human. My hands were shaking as I examined them more closely. They formed patterns that made no sense. They crisscrossed each other. They circled the main transformer in what looked like a ritual arrangement. The most chilling discovery was that the footprints were different sizes. Adult feet, child feet, bare footprints next to shoe prints, and they all ended at the exact same spot near the transformer. As if everyone who made those footprints had simply ceased to exist at that location. I called my supervisor immediately and reported what I found. I told him about the disturbing electrical fluctuations and the impossible footprints. I expected him to send maintenance to investigate. Instead, he told me not to go back to the site and to keep quiet about what I'd seen. That is when I knew something terrifying was happening. Power company supervisors don't tell you to stay silent about safety issues. Not unless someone had already told them to. I did what any reasonable person would do. I ignored his instructions and went back to Merrow Peak that evening. This is where the fear becomes something more than just a memory. The lights were there, exactly like I imagined them from the electrical disturbances. They hung above the peak in a formation that wasn't quite stationary and wasn't quite moving. 3 lights arranged in a triangle. The color was wrong. Not quite white, not quite blue. Something in between that made my eyes hurt to look at. They were pulsing in rhythm with something. I realized after a few minutes that they were pulsing in rhythm with the electrical current flowing through the transmission lines. The lights in the power grid were synchronized. They were communicating with each other somehow. I stood there for over an hour, watching those eerie, haunting lights, and I documented everything with my phone. The lights, the grid readings on my equipment, the footprints, the cut fence. Everything. I had no idea what I was looking at, but I knew I needed to record it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my apartment reviewing the footage and comparing it to years of historical data from the Merrow Peak station. What I discovered was unsettling. The electrical disturbances went back further than I realized. At least 5 years. Maybe longer. But they've been subtle. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. Recurring. Cyclical. Increasing in frequency. On Thursday morning, federal agents arrived at our power company offices. They showed up without warning, presented credentials, and began asking questions about the Merrow Peak station. Specific questions. They wanted to know about unusual power readings, about any reports of strange activity, about my visit to the site. Someone had reported what I told my supervisor. The agents knew about the lights. They knew about the footprints. They knew everything I observed. They also knew about my video footage. They asked for it specifically. When I hesitated, they simply took my phone. They didn't ask permission. They just took it and left. The chilling part was that they didn't seem interested in figuring out what the lights were. They seemed interested in making sure nobody else found out about them. They told me that discussing what I'd seen with anyone would be a federal crime. They told me the area was being quarantined for a hazardous materials investigation. They told me that my employer would be receiving official instructions to avoid the area permanently. Within hours, there was a blockade on the road to Merrow Peak. Military vehicles, soldiers, federal agents. The entire mountain became a restricted zone. I tried to access the power company records for that station. The files had been deleted. Not archived, not transferred, deleted completely. It was as if the Merrow Peak station had never existed in our system. The only reason I knew I hadn't imagined it was because my coworkers remembered it and were equally terrified about the federal presence. Then people started disappearing. The first person was my supervisor. He called me Thursday evening and told me he needed to talk. He said he knew more about what was happening, and he needed to meet me somewhere private. He wanted to meet at a diner about 20 miles from town, somewhere off the beaten path where federal agents wouldn't notice us. I agreed. I met him at the diner. He never arrived. His car was found the next day, parked in the diner lot with the keys still in the ignition. The doors were unlocked. His wallet was on the driver's seat. He was gone. No body, no signs of violence, just an abandoned vehicle and an absence that terrified everyone who knew him. The next person was a wildlife officer who reported seeing strange activity near Merrow Peak 3 weeks earlier. His body was found in a ravine. The official report said it was suicide. He'd driven off a cliff in an area he hiked hundreds of times. The terrifying part was that his body showed signs of exposure to extreme cold. In March, in the mountains, in a climate that never gets colder than freezing. Then a hiker, then a property owner who lived near the base of the mountain. Then a federal agent who had been stationed at the blockade. All of them missing or found dead under circumstances that made no sense. All of them having reported unusual activity near Merrow Peak. The fear became personal when I received a message on a secure app. The message was sent from a blocked number, and it contained just one image. A photograph taken from inside the chain link fence at the Merrow Peak station. The photograph showed me, it showed something that looked like me, standing among the thousands of footprints, facing toward the transformer with my hands hanging at my sides in an unnatural position. The horrifying realization was that I'd never been to the fence interior. I did never step past that chain link barrier. Yet the photograph showed me clearly, standing in that exact spot, wearing clothes I owned, with my face perfectly visible. I understood then what I was looking at. The lights weren't an external phenomenon. They weren't visitors or probes or anything coming from outside. The lights were a byproduct of something that had been using our electrical grid for years. Something that could simulate human presence. Something that could extract an image of me from my own mind and place it in a location where my body had never been. The disappearances weren't random. They were strategic. Anyone who seen the lights and survived was being removed. Anyone who reported the activity was being eliminated. And now I had evidence that whatever was on Merrow Peak had the ability to reach into my life and prove that I couldn't trust my own experience. I stopped going to work. I stopped answering my phone. I installed better locks on my apartment, but I knew it wouldn't matter. The fear became so overwhelming that I couldn't eat or sleep. Every shadow seemed to hide something terrifying. Every electrical flicker made me jump. I was becoming paranoid, but I wasn't wrong to be paranoid. Last week, I finally found a pattern in the federal activity. By accessing public records and news archives, I discovered that the lights had appeared before. Not just 5 years ago, decades ago. There were reports from the 1970s. References in local papers to mysterious activity on Merrow Peak. Investigations that went nowhere. Then I found something scarier. In 1984, federal agents had sealed off Merrow Peak completely for 6 months. During that time, the electrical grid in the region experienced unprecedented fluctuations. Power outages lasted for weeks in some areas. And then, suddenly, the federal presence withdrew. The blockade came down. No official explanation was ever given. What I realized was that this wasn't a one-time event. This was cyclical, recurring. The lights would appear, federal agents would respond, people would disappear, and then everything would return to normal. Until the next cycle began. The chilling truth they uncovered is that the lights aren't trying to invade or conquer or communicate in any meaningful way. They reharvesting something. They retaking something from the electrical grid and using human beings to do it. The footprints at the substation, the people disappearing, the federal cover-up, all of it is part of a process that has been running for at least 40 years. And the cycle is accelerating. The disturbances are becoming more frequent. The missing people are adding up faster. The federal response is becoming more aggressive. Whatever is happening on Merrow Peak is reaching a critical point. I know what is coming. I can feel it in the terrifying certainty that I can escape. Within days, the lights will appear again. Within weeks, federal agents will close the mountain. Within months, more people will vanish, and I'll be marked for elimination because I've seen too much. But the most unsettling realization is what I've discovered about my own electrical usage. I've been analyzing the power consumption patterns in my apartment, and they don't match anything my devices should be using. Something is drawing power from my home. Something is using my connection to the grid to do what it does. The lights on Merrow Peak aren't the source. They were just visible proof of something that is already everywhere, woven into every electrical system in this region. Every substation, every power line, every home connected to the grid. Last night, I saw the shadow in my apartment. It wasn't darkness. It was something that existed independently of the light sources. Something that moved with intentional purpose. Something that had my face when it turned to look at me. I am writing this knowing that I don't have much time. Knowing that the federal agents will find me eventually. Knowing that I'll disappear just like the others and become one more missing person in a pattern that nobody is officially allowed to acknowledge. The horrifying truth about the Appalachian Watchtower ISN, that something is out there on Merrow Peak. The truth is that something has always been here. Using us. Using our power. Using our bodies. Using our fear as fuel for a process that has been running for longer than any of us have been alive. And every time the lights appear, it gets stronger. Every time someone tries to expose it, it erases them. And every time the federal government responds, they not trying to stop it. They trying to manage it. To keep the rest of the world from knowing what's really happening in these mountains. I am going to turn off my electricity now. I am going to disconnect from the grid. I don't know if it will help. I don't know if it will matter. But I know that something is coming, and I know that my time is running out. The only question that remains unsettled in my mind is whether the fear I feel is genuine paranoia, or if it is an accurate assessment of a danger that the government has decided I am not allowed to survive knowing about. Either way, I want to be here to find out the answer. The lights are getting closer, and they starting to look like me. Story 2. Holler House Calls. The dispatcher said a voice was calling from a house that burned down in 1987. I was a 911 dispatcher for Harlan County in eastern Kentucky for 8 years. I handled hundreds of calls, accidents, domestic violence, heart attacks, house fires. I did learn to stay calm under pressure, to ask the right questions, to get emergency responders to the right location fast. It is important work. Boring most nights, but important. Then the calls started coming in from Holler House. That's what locals called it. a sprawling farmhouse nestled in the hollers of Appalachia, about 5 miles from the nearest paved road. The name was simple and eerie, just Holler House. The property had been abandoned for years before burning down completely in a terrifying house fire that killed 3 people. The investigation concluded it was faulty wiring. The house was never rebuilt. Nobody wanted that land, but someone was calling for help from there. The first call came in at 2:30 in the morning on a Tuesday. The caller ID showed a number that didn't match any active phone line in our system. Our database flagged it as inactive, property destroyed, no current residents. The voice on the line was a woman, her tone urgent but strange, like she was speaking from underwater. She said her daughter was sick. She said they needed an ambulance immediately. She said something was wrong with the girl, something eerie and chilling that she couldn't quite explain. The woman's voice cracked with fear and desperation as she gave me the address, the exact coordinates of the burned-out Holler House. I asked her if she was sure about the address. She repeated it, this time with more urgency, her voice becoming almost frantic. I told her I was sending help. I dispatched the nearest ambulance and made detailed notes in our system. An active address, impossible phone source, terrifying circumstances. The ambulance arrived 17 minutes later. The paramedics radioed back that there was nothing there. No house, no people, just burned foundation stones and charred wood scattered across an overgrown field. They found no signs of life, no recent activity, nothing that suggested anyone had been there in decades. I was disturbed by the call, but I filed it away. Prank calls happen. People get confused about addresses. My job was to dispatch, not to investigate. The second call came 3 nights later. This time it was a man, his voice, deep and hollow, speaking in a terrified whisper. He said his wife was having a heart attack. He said they needed help now. He gave the same address, Holler House. I could hear the panic in his voice, a genuine fear that made my stomach tighten. I dispatched another ambulance immediately. Again, nothing. The paramedics found an empty field. No house, no people, no signs of distress anywhere. I started keeping a log. Over the next 2 weeks, we received 7 more calls from Holler House. Each one was a different voice. Each one described a different emergency. A fire, an overdose, a gunshot wound, a drowning in a creek that hadn't existed for years. Each call was urgent and terrifying, filled with genuine-sounding panic and fear. And each one was completely impossible. The chilling part was that the calls seemed to know details about emergencies that hadn't happened yet in our county. The fire call came 3 days before an actual house fire in Harlan. The drowning call came a week before a child actually drowned in the river. The terrifying pattern suggested the calls were predicting deaths, not describing current emergencies. I mentioned this to my supervisor, a man named Roger Hayes who worked dispatch for 23 years. His reaction frightened me more than the calls themselves. His face went pale. He told me to stop logging the Holler House calls. He said to document them as system errors and delete them from the permanent record. He said to not mention them to anyone. When I asked him why, he looked at me with a fear in his eyes that made my skin crawl. He told me that dispatch had been receiving calls from Holler House for much longer than I had been working there. He said previous dispatchers had tried to investigate. He said some of them had quit. One had moved out of state entirely. The eerie, unsettling truth was that Roger had heard the Holler House calls himself. And he said there was something disturbing about the voices, something that didn't sound entirely human. Something that sounded like it was speaking through people who weren't quite alive anymore. I should have quit that night, but something compelled me to keep working the phones, to keep taking calls, to wait for the next Holler House call to come through. The creepy fascination with understanding what was happening kept me at my desk night after night. The next call came on a Friday evening at 8:45. This time, the voice was a child. His voice. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, crying, terrified, saying there were shadows in the house and they wouldn't go away. The eerie, chilling sound of her crying was so heartbreaking and genuine that I felt my chest tighten with real emotion. She said the shadows were touching her. She said they were cold. She said they were hungry. I traced the call while speaking to her. The line originated from coordinates exactly matching the Holler House location, but the phone was listed as destroyed in the 1987 fire. No active service, no possibility of signal, yet the call was coming through perfectly clear. I asked the girl her name. There was a long pause. Then she said something that made my blood freeze. She said her name, and I realized I knew that name. It was the name of a girl who had died in the Holler House fire in 1987. A girl who had been dead for 36 years. The call cut off abruptly. I sat in complete silence, my hands shaking, staring at the log on my screen. I knew what I experienced wasn't impossible, but the evidence was right there in our system. A call from a dead child at a burned-down house. That night, I did something I shouldn't have. I went to Holler House. I drove up the winding mountain roads in my personal vehicle, using GPS to guide me to the coordinates. The road became progressively worse, narrower, darker. The trees on either side seemed to lean inward, creating a tunnel of darkness that my headlights could barely penetrate. The eerie, suffocating atmosphere grew more intense with every mile. The foundation stones appeared suddenly around a bend, ghostly white in my headlights, surrounded by charred timber and overgrown vegetation. The night was completely silent. No crickets, no night sounds, just absolute, terrifying quiet. I got out of my car and walked toward the ruins. The ground was uneven, covered in debris. I could see where the old foundation had been. The outline of rooms, the darkened rectangle where the hearth had stood. Scattered across the area were fragments of the life that had been destroyed here. A piece of a ceramic dish, part of a leather shoe, scraps of metal that might have been from a bed frame. I stood in the middle of the foundation and called out. I asked who was calling. I asked why they were calling for help. I asked if anyone was there. The temperature dropped suddenly, not gradually, instantly. My breath became visible. The darkness around the ruins seemed to deepen, becoming less like absence of light and more like the presence of something else. Something watching. Then I heard it, a voice, not through my phone but in the air around me. A woman's voice, distorted and eerie, speaking in a tone that suggested her mouth was not quite aligned with her words. She said my name. She said it slowly, drawing it out, savoring each syllable. She said she'd been waiting for me to come. I ran. I crashed through the dark back to my car, my heart pounding, my mind screaming at me to get away from this place. I didn't stop driving until I reached the county line. I called in sick the next day, and the day after that. On the third day, I returned to work to find that several things had changed. The Holler House calls had stopped appearing in our system. When I tried to pull up the logs, they were gone. Completely erased. It was like they never happened. But that wasn't the terrifying part. The terrifying part was finding something on my desk when I arrived for my shift. A photograph. An old Polaroid. Faded and yellow with age. It showed a family standing in front of Holler House. A man, a woman, and 3 children. The house was intact in the photo, thriving, surrounded by gardens and farm equipment. The photo was dated 1982, 5 years before the fire. But what made my blood run cold was that I recognized one of the children in the photo. It was the little girl, the one who he called on Friday, the one who he'd been dead for 36 years. And in the photo, she was looking directly at the camera, looking directly at whoever had taken the picture. But her eyes were wrong. They were empty, hollow, like something was looking out through her that wasn't to her. Roger told me to stop asking questions. He told me to forget the Holler House calls. He told me to go home and live my life and never speak about this to anyone. His voice was heavy with a kind of hopelessness, like he was warning me about something inevitable and terrifying that I couldn't prevent. I quit my job that week, but the nightmare didn't stop, because the calls started coming to my personal phone. At first, they were silent, just static, that eerie, unsettling sound of dead air on the line. Then came the whispers, voices underneath the static, too quiet to understand, but clearly speaking. Speaking urgently, speaking with fear and desperation. Last week, I received a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something compelled me to. The voice was the little girl, this voice again. She said they were calling for a reason. She said they needed help because they were trapped. She said the house was still burning. She said it had never stopped burning. She said the fire was cold and hungry and it was consuming them over and over again, an endless nightmare of pain and darkness. She said other people were trapped there too, people who called 911 over the years, people who tried to help, people who had gotten too close to understanding what was happening. She said the house existed in a place between things, not quite real, not quite gone, stuck in an eternal moment of catastrophe. The chilling, horrifying truth she revealed was this: every 911 call from Holler House wasn't coming from the past. It was coming from the present. from people who answered calls to that location, emergency responders who had gone out to help, dispatchers who had gotten too curious, all of them trapped in a place where time doesn't work right, where death happens repeatedly, where the fire never ends. I hung up immediately. I disabled my phone. I've been living in a state of constant fear for the past week, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the terrifying realization that the call wasn't just coming from outside anymore. The eerie, unsettling truth is that I think it was already inside me. Last night, I heard a voice coming from my own mouth. Not my voice, a woman's voice, distorted and echoing, saying my name in that slow, savoring way. I wasn't speaking. My lips weren't moving, but the voice came from my body, my lungs, my throat. The horrifying, nightmare reality I've come to accept is that Holler House doesn't just call for help. It calls people into itself. It's been doing it for decades. And I am terrified that when my next shift would have been, when my replacement would have answered the 911 line, they would have heard my voice calling from an address that burned down 36 years ago. Calling for help from a place where help never comes. Calling from the darkness. Calling from the creepy, eternal fire that never goes out. If you, a dispatcher, if you handle emergency calls, if you ever receive a call from an impossible address, Don, T answer. Don, to respond. Don, to try to trace it. Don, to investigate. Because Holler House is always hungry. And it's always waiting for someone to answer back. Story 3. Woman who never hanged. The terrifying question nobody in Mercy Creek could answer was simple. Where did Sarah Blackwood disappear to the night before they hanged her? My name is Thomas Garrett, and I found the answer 3 years ago while researching my family history. What I discovered in those old newspapers and sealed town records changed everything I understood about fear, darkness, and what people are capable of hiding. This story is true, every disturbing detail of it. I was cataloging my grandfather's papers in his old house in eastern Kentucky when I found the journal. It was hidden behind a loose stone in the basement fireplace, wrapped in oilcloth, dated 1928. Inside were names, dates, and a confession about something the town of Mercy Creek had spent a century trying to forget. The creepy part started when I realized none of this was in any official records. According to what I found, Sarah Blackwood was a woman in her 60s who lived alone on the edge of Mercy Creek. The townspeople called her a witch, not as a joke or old-fashioned insult, but as a genuine, terrifying accusation. They claimed she performed dark folk magic, that she cursed families, that children who crossed her died from unexplained illnesses, that livestock would sicken and die after she walked past. The fear and paranoia about her had been building for years, simmering in the darkness of the Appalachian Mountains, waiting for something to ignite it. That something came in 1928 when a woman named Margaret Thorne, his son, died. He was healthy one day, burning with fever and covered in strange marks the next. The doctor had no explanation. Margaret was desperate for answers, for someone to blame. She went to see Sarah Blackwood, confronted her, and demanded to know what curse she placed on her boy. Sarah supposedly laughed at her, told her the boy had gotten sick because his mother was weak and foolish, told her that some people were meant to suffer, told her the curse was real and would only get worse. By evening, half the town believed it. By the next morning, a mob had formed. What made the terrifying truth so horrifying was that it wasn't recorded anywhere in official documents. No arrest warrant, no trial transcript, no newspaper account, just a town collectively deciding that Sarah Blackwood needed to die, and then doing it quietly, away from outside eyes. They arrested her on a Tuesday. They convicted her on Wednesday. They prepared the gallows for Thursday morning. But Thursday morning came and Sarah Blackwood was gone, vanished from the locked jail cell, left no body behind, left no trace, just empty air and an eerie silence that nobody wanted to disturb by asking questions. My grandfather, this journal, described the town's response to her disappearance. The dark, unsettling panic that gripped everyone. Not panic about a prisoner escaping, but panic about something else. Something supernatural. Something that suggested Sarah Blackwood had never been entirely human. According to my grandfather, this account, Sarah had claimed she wouldn't hang. She stood in front of the gathered townspeople and said that death couldn't hold her. That she would disappear into the darkness between things. That she would be waiting in the spaces nobody looked. That she would remember every name, every face, every hand that touched the rope. The entry that chilled me most was dated the night after her disappearance. My grandfather wrote, "She kept her word. She is still here. I can feel her watching from the darkness. We all can, and I think we finally understand what they've done." The next entries became increasingly disturbing. My grandfather documented strange occurrences in Mercy Creek. Families falling sick with the same mysterious illness that had taken Margaret Thorne's son. Livestock dying for no reason. Children disappearing into the woods and being found days later with no memory of where they'd been. Accidents that seemed almost deliberately arranged to cause maximum suffering. And always, underneath it all, was the creepy sensation of being watched. Of eyes in the darkness that weren't human anymore. My grandfather had become convinced that Sarah Blackwood had existed partially outside of normal reality. That her death and disappearance had transformed her into something that wasn't alive but wasn't dead either. Something that existed in the shadows. Something that was patient and methodical about its revenge. The most chilling entry was from 1936, 8 years after Sarah's disappearance. My grandfather wrote about a girl who had gone into the forest and hadn't come back for 3 days. When they found her, she was standing in the middle of a clearing, swaying back and forth, speaking in a voice that wasn't her own. She was speaking Sarah Blackwood's words, speaking about the hands that had held the rope, speaking their names and describing terrible things that were going to happen to them. Families where the fathers had participated in the mob that arrested her. The girl recovered, but she never spoke normally again. She would occasionally enter trances where Sarah's voice would come out of her mouth. Speaking threats, speaking promises of suffering, speaking knowledge of future deaths that came true with eerie accuracy. I made copies of the journal entries and tried to verify them against newspaper archives. Nothing, not a single mention of Sarah Blackwood, not a mention of the girl possessed by her voice, not a mention of the deaths that followed. It was as if the town had collectively decided to erase her from history, to pretend she never existed. But the most horrifying part of my investigation was what I discovered about my grandfather himself. He died in 1947. The official cause was a heart attack, but according to his own final journal entries, he was dying from something else. Something that had been slowly consuming him from the inside. He described increasing paranoia, the sensation of Sarah Blackwood's presence getting closer, the feeling of hands that weren't hands touching him in the darkness. And most chillingly, he described an overwhelming compulsion to go into the forest. To walk deeper and deeper into the woods where the trees grew so close together that no sunlight could reach the ground. His final entry read, "She is calling me now. I can hear her voice in the darkness. I know what is waiting for me in the forest. I know I want to be coming back. And I know I deserve it. We all deserve it. We should have let her live." My grandfather was found dead at the edge of the forest, about 2 miles from his house. The official report said he had a heart attack while walking. But I've always wondered if that was the truth. I've always wondered if he walked into that forest and encountered something that his heart simply couldn't survive. After finding the journal, I became obsessed. I went to Mercy Creek. I talked to old residents who still remembered stories their grandparents had told. Most of them refused to speak about Sarah Blackwood. But one elderly woman, nearly 90 years old, invited me into her house and told me what she heard growing up. Her grandmother had been friends with Margaret Thorne, the woman whose son had gotten sick. According to her story, Margaret Thorne had gone insane after Sarah's disappearance. She did become convinced that Sarah was still alive somehow, still present, still hunting her. Margaret had eventually walked into the forest on a winter night and never came back. They found her body 3 months later, frozen solid, but with no snow or ice covering her. Just clear proof that she'd been lying there the entire time, exposed to the elements, and yet she hadn't been discovered until spring. The woman told me something that made my skin crawl. She said that people in Mercy Creek still disappeared sometimes, usually during certain times of year. Always people who had ancestors that participated in Sarah's arrest. Always people who were alone in the woods. And when they were found, they never remembered where they'd been or what had happened to them. I asked her if she believed Sarah Blackwood was still alive, still haunting the town. She didn't answer directly. She just looked at me with eyes full of ancient fear and told me to leave Mercy Creek. She said that researching what happened to Sarah was dangerous, that some things needed to stay forgotten, that the town had made a deal with darkness in order to survive, and nobody should disturb that arrangement. I left the next day. But the eerie feeling has never left me. The sensation of being watched. Of eyes in the darkness that are waiting for something. I've started having nightmares about forests where the trees have faces. About hands reaching out of shadows. About a woman's voice calling my name from deep in the darkness. The terrifying realization I've come to is that my grandfather was right. Sarah Blackwood, I said, he did. She exists in some horrifying space between life and death. Between the visible world and the shadow places. And she is still collecting her due. Still punishing descendants. Still calling people into the forest. And the most chilling discovery came last month when I was organizing old court documents from the county clerk's office. I found a single, carefully hidden record. 1 page, filed away with no documentation. It was a trial summary from 1928. Sarah Blackwood's trial. And it listed the names of the 23 men who voted to hang her. My grandfather's name was on that list. I started tracing what happened to all 23 names. Every single one of them had died in unusual circumstances. Car accidents on clear roads. Falls from safe places. Sudden illnesses. Mysterious disappearances. Suicides. Always before age 70. Always with an eerie sense that something had driven them to their deaths. The last name on the list died just 6 months ago. A man named Ernest Kelso who lived 3 towns over from Mercy Creek. He walked into a river on a summer day and drowned. Despite being an excellent swimmer who lived on that river his entire life. Which means the last descendant of someone who participated in her trial. And I started hearing her voice. Late at night, coming from the forest behind my house. Speaking my name. Speaking in a voice that sounds almost loving. Telling me that it was almost time. That she has been waiting for me. That I need to come into the forest and meet her. That everything will be clear once I do. I am writing this down because I want someone to know what really happened. What happened to Sarah Blackwood? What is still happening in Mercy Creek and to everyone connected to her death? I want someone to understand that there are old debts in the Appalachian darkness. Debts that are paid slowly but inevitably. Debts written in blood and fear and the screams of people who realize too late what they'd done. The terrifying truth is that I can feel myself being pulled toward the forest. I can feel her presence growing stronger every night. And I know, with absolute certainty, that very soon I am going to stop resisting. I am going to walk out into that darkness. And I am going to learn what happens to the last name on that terrifying list. Sarah Blackwood is still waiting. She has been patient for nearly a century. But her patience is almost at an end. And when it is, she is going to have her final due. The forest is calling me now. And I don't think I can say no much longer. Story 4. Vanishing County Jail Prisoner. Released on paper only. There, as a man who walked out of a jail cell in West Virginia and stopped existing, except on the paperwork. My name is Sheriff Dale Hutchins. They've been the sheriff of Harlan County for 23 years, and they never had to say the words I'm about to tell you. I never wanted to, but the man doesn't exist anymore, and nobody seems to care. So I'm going to tell the truth before they make sure I forget it too. It started with a prisoner named Robert Cavell. Nothing special about him on the surface. 38 years old, arrested for drunk driving, 3rd offense. He'd been in my jail before, in and out, a harmless repeat offender who usually served 30 to 60 days and then disappeared back into the mountains where he lived. This time was different. Robert arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. I remember because my deputy was sick, and I was handling intake myself. Robert was quiet. That's what struck me as odd. Most people come in angry or scared or talkative. Robert was just silent. He looked at me with eyes that didn't quite focus on anything, like he was seeing through me into something behind me. His pupils were dilated despite the bright lights in the processing room. I should have flagged it for medical evaluation. Instead, I processed him like routine. He was assigned to cell 14 on the 2nd floor. A single cell, solid door with a small window. Nothing remarkable about it. On the morning of March 19th, I came into the jail to find something unsettling. The night shift deputy, a man named Curtis, was sitting at the desk looking confused. When I asked him how the night had been, he said it was fine, quiet, normal. But he had no memory of processing Robert's release paperwork. The release sheet was right there in the files, signed by Curtis, dated that morning at 5:15 a.m. The paperwork said Robert had been released on personal recognizance, that he signed the forms, that he'd been escorted to the front entrance by Curtis himself. Except Curtis had no memory of it happening. When I asked if Robert was still in the building, we went to check cell 14. The door was locked. The window showed nothing but darkness inside. I opened the cell, and I found something horrifying that I still can explain. The cell was completely empty. Not just empty of people, empty of everything. The mattress was gone. The blankets were gone. The metal toilet was gone. The sink was gone. There was nothing in that room but bare concrete floor and white walls. No furniture, no fixtures, nothing that would indicate anyone had ever been in that space. My hands were shaking as I stood in that doorway. I looked at Curtis and asked him directly, "Did you release Robert Cavell last night?" Curtis looked at me with an expression of complete fear. He said yes. He said he had released him. He described walking Robert to the front entrance. He described Robert signing forms. He described watching Robert walk out into the darkness. He could recall the entire transaction in perfect detail. But Curtis had no memory of entering that cell. No memory of opening the door. No memory of the actual release happening. And the cell itself was terrifying because it was impossible. You can remove a toilet from a concrete cell in 15 minutes. You can remove a sink that is bolted into the wall. It would take hours of work with tools we didn't have. I called the state police. I reported what I found. The response I got was strange. The officer I spoke with got quiet for a long moment, and then he asked me if I was sure about what I'd seen. He asked me to check the paperwork again. He asked me to verify that Robert Cavell was actually a real person with an actual arrest record. So I checked, and here is where the fear becomes something deeper and more disturbing. Robert Cavell existed in my system. I had his intake forms. I had his mugshots. I had his cell assignment. But when I looked back at the video footage from the intake process, something chilling was wrong. The camera showed me processing someone, but the image was blurry. Not like camera malfunction blurry, like the image of Robert himself was deliberately obscured. I could see my hands, the desk, the paperwork. But where Robert should have been, there was a shadow, a dark shape that looked vaguely human but wasn't quite right. The intake video from earlier that week showed the same thing. Every footage of Robert was corrupted in exactly the same way, as if something had erased him from the recordings while leaving everything else untouched. I kept digging, and each discovery made the fear worse. I pulled Robert's arrest record from the system. He'd been arrested 4 times in our county, 4 separate incidents, but the officers who arrested him had no memory of making those arrests. Their paperwork existed, his file existed, but nobody who actually interacted with him could remember doing so. The most chilling discovery was when I called the address he listed on intake forms. A house deep in the hills outside of town. The woman who answered said she never heard of Robert Cavell. She said nobody by that name had ever lived in her house. She said she was confused why I was calling, and she seemed genuinely terrified by my questions. I spent the next 3 weeks investigating something that officially didn't exist. An arrest, a prisoner, a release. All documented on paper but leaving no traces in human memory. The paperwork was perfect. The forms were filled out correctly. The signatures matched. The dates lined up. But the substance was gone. The reality had vanished. The eerie feeling grew when I started noticing other things. Other prisoners who'd been released had strange gaps in their paperwork. Not major ones, just small inconsistencies. A release that didn't have the proper notation. A transport record that was missing a signature. Files that seemed incomplete in ways that made no sense. I started reviewing years of release records, and I found a pattern that made my blood go cold. Every 6 months to a year, there was a prisoner who had been released on paper but had left no other trace. No family reported them. No halfway houses registered them. No subsequent arrests. They simply disappeared from reality while their paperwork insisted they left the system. Over 15 years of records, I found 23 of them. 23 people who had been officially released from my jail and then stopped existing in any meaningful way. I brought this to the attention of the state police. I told them what I found. The response was immediate and terrifying. Within hours, 2 state officials arrived at my office. They didn't introduce themselves with names. They simply told me that what I discovered was a matter of state security and that I needed to stop investigating immediately. They confiscated my research. Every file, every note, everything. They told me that discussing this with anyone would result in federal charges. They told me that my concerns were unfounded and that I was likely experiencing stress-related confusion. But before they left, one of them pulled me aside. He looked at me with eyes that showed genuine fear. And he said something I will never forget. He said, "You haven't found the real problem yet. You only found the records. You haven't found the reason why it happens." I understood what he meant after thinking about it for days. The question wasn't how people were disappearing from existence. The question was why my jail was being used as a collection point. Why certain prisoners were being selected. What happened to them after they disappeared. The terrifying realization came when I thought about those blank spots in the video footage. The shadow where Robert Cavell should have been. I started reviewing prisoner intake footage from other jails in the region. I called my contacts at facilities in neighboring counties and asked them the same question. Had they noticed any corrupted footage? Any prisoners with unclear images on video? Every single one of them said yes. Every jail in a 5-county radius had the same issue. Video footage with shadows instead of faces. Paperwork that documented people who nobody could actually remember. Release records that led nowhere. The nightmare became complete when I realized that this wasn't happening to my jail. My jail was part of something larger. A system. A process. Something that was using county jails throughout the Appalachian region to collect people, process them, and then vanish them completely. And the most disturbing part was that the system was official. The paperwork was genuine. The procedures were being followed. Everything was legal and documented and terrifyingly routine. I stopped investigating. I don't go near the files anymore. I don't look at the video footage. I learned to pretend that those releases are normal, that the missing records don't matter, that the blank spots in the footage are just technical glitches. Because I realized something scarier than any of the missing people. I started noticing gaps in my own memory. Small ones, times when I'm not sure what I did or where I was. Conversations I should remember but can't quite grasp. And 3 days ago, I looked at the security footage from my office, and I saw a shadow standing behind me. Not a person, a shadow shaped vaguely like a human form. Standing there while I worked, visible only in the video, never in the actual office. The chilling truth is that whatever is collecting these people, whatever is using our jails as part of its process, it is looking for something. And I am starting to suspect it might have found what it was looking for. Last night, I found a release form on my desk that I didn't remember filling out. It was dated for tomorrow. It was authorizing the release of a prisoner in cell 14, a prisoner whose name I couldn't quite read in the paperwork. The image was blurry, obscured by shadow. I realized I was looking at my own release paperwork. I don't know what is going to happen tomorrow morning. I don't know if I'll still remember my name. I don't know if anyone will remember me. But I know what the blank spot in the video footage means now. I understand what the shadows are. They read not errors. They read the process. Whatever is being removed, whatever is being collected by this system, it is being erased from reality itself. Not just killed, erased, unmade, pulled out of existence in a way that leaves only paperwork behind. Records that say someone was here, someone was released, someone moved forward into the world. But they didn't. They went somewhere else, somewhere terrifying and dark and completely unknown. And now it's my turn. The horror of this realization I said, just that I'm being taken. It's that I approved the process. I helped it work. I processed the paperwork. I looked the other way. And now I am going to disappear. And tomorrow morning, my deputy is going to find my release forms filled out and signed. He won. Remember me. He won. Remember processing me. He'll just process the paperwork and move on. The jail will continue operating. The system will continue running. And somewhere out there will be another county jail in another part of the mountains where another sheriff is starting to ask the same questions I asked. And they won't get any answers either. It will just join the rest of us in the darkness, in the space between the paperwork and reality, where people are stored after they've been officially released from existence. I can feel it happening already. The edges of my memory getting soft. My name becoming hard to hold on to. The shadow growing darker and closer every time I look in a mirror. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to walk out of my own jail cell. But I want to be walking anywhere at all. I'll just be paperwork now. Just another blank spot in the video footage. Just another shadow where a person used to be.
For years, Julian Carter never doubted that he truly understood his wife. They had worked side by side at the same corporation for 6 years, been officially married for 9, and spent countless evenings discussing work matters while dirty dishes waited their turn in the sink. Rachel was far more than just a wife to him. She was his partner, the person he could trust with his deepest secrets, a woman who understood their private jokes about coworkers and could predict how his sentences would end long before he finished them himself. In the eyes of everyone at the electronics distribution company where they both worked, they were considered the model married couple. Living proof that workplace romances could actually succeed. Every year, the corporate Christmas party took place on the second Friday of December. This established tradition was maintained by management with demonstrative pomp and ceremony. This time, they chose the Grand Meridian Hotel Complex as the venue, a massive 20-story building featuring mirrored ballrooms and lighting fixtures so heavy they seemed to rival entire automobiles in weight. The anticipation of this evening had kept Rachel on edge for weeks. She carefully selected a dark blue dress that, according to Julian, exceptionally highlighted the color of her eyes, and tried numerous hairstyle options before settling on an elegant updo that gracefully exposed her neckline. That evening, she gave the impression of someone radiating particular beauty. Julian repeatedly caught himself watching her from the opposite end of the grand hall, where she was animatedly chatting with representatives from the marketing department, her joyful laughter carrying under the warm golden glow of the holiday decorations. Around 10:30 p.m., Julian was standing by the bar, conversing with a couple of employees from the operations department, when he suddenly realized Rachel was missing. He carefully scanned the entire ballroom space, trying to locate that same blue dress among the crowd of half-drunk employees and managers, people eager to make a positive impression on upper management. No luck. He checked the corridor areas near the restrooms, the outdoor area where smokers gathered, and even the hotel's front desk. Rachel was nowhere to be found. 43 minutes passed. In Julian's chest, an anxious feeling began to form, something elusive that he couldn't quite define, yet it kept his body in a state of tension, constricting his muscles as if his physical shell sensed approaching danger. And then she finally appeared in his line of sight. Her walk along one of the side corridors was hurried. She could barely maintain her balance in high heels, almost tripping over something. Julian managed to intercept her before she could return to the main hall. And it was at this moment that he noticed the details. Her hair, which just a few hours earlier had been perfectly arranged, now displayed complete disarray. Individual strands fell unevenly across her shoulders, as if someone had carelessly run their hands through it. The makeup around the corners of her eyes looked slightly smudged, and her lipstick had almost completely disappeared. There was also a distinct smell, powerful and unmistakable, a woody masculine fragrance, definitely not the one Julian wore. This cologne clung to her dress, mixing with something else, something he consciously refused to identify in that moment. "Where were you?" Julian asked quietly, trying not to attract unnecessary attention from those around them. Rachel looked away and nervously began smoothing her hair with trembling fingers. "I felt sick."
14 officers went to investigate the clearing. Only 11 came back. The 3 missing officers were found 3 days later, wandering the forest miles away from the scene, unable to speak coherently. They had no memory of the investigation, no memory of entering the clearing, no recollection of the missing time, which their medical records indicated was at least 36 hours. When they finally spoke, their account was terrifying and eerie. They described the clearing, but their descriptions didn't match what the other officers had seen. They talked about symbols that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. They described hearing sounds that made their skin crawl and their minds feel wrong. One officer claimed he'd seen something in the darkness beyond the clearing, a shape that was too large to be human, that moved in ways that violated natural physics. All 3 officers subsequently quit their jobs. 2 relocated out of state. The 3rd committed suicide 6 months later. After that incident, the sheriff sealed the investigation permanently. His final notation simply stated, "Blood Creek matter concluded. Ongoing investigation would create danger to personnel and public. Recommend permanent file closure and restricted access." I was trembling as I photographed every page of that file. The nightmare details were so vivid, so terrifying, that my hands were shaking. I could feel the fear that Hayes himself had felt, the creeping dread that had possessed him as he tried to comprehend what was happening near that creek. I should have closed the file, returned it to the archives, and walked away. I should have forgotten I ever found it. But instead, I drove to Blood Creek. The location is remote, nestled in a valley between two ridges, about 8 miles from the nearest town. A narrow gravel road leads down to a parking area that had been installed sometime after the sealed investigation. The creek itself is surprisingly beautiful. Clear water running over smooth stones, surrounded by dense forest. Nothing about the landscape suggests anything horrifying or eerie. I walked upstream for nearly an hour before I found the clearing. I recognized it immediately from the photographs in the police file. The stone altars were still there, weathered but distinct. The trees bore carved symbols, still clearly visible after 30 years. The ground was scattered with bones, animal bones mostly, but some that looked disturbingly large, disturbingly human-shaped. The chilling, terrifying feeling that overcame me was absolute and overwhelming. The atmosphere itself felt wrong, heavy, suffocating, like the air was carrying weight it shouldn't. The shadows under the trees seemed darker than they should be in daylight. The sounds of the forest, normally a pleasant background, felt menacing and disturbing. I began photographing everything. As I was documenting the symbols carved into the largest tree, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Fresh symbols had been carved alongside the old ones, not weathered by decades of exposure. Fresh, recent, some looked only days old. The ritualistic activity hadn't stopped. It had just gone deeper underground, away from police notice. I should have left immediately. Instead, I followed a path deeper into the forest, pulled toward something I didn't understand. The fear was there, pounding in my chest, but it was overridden by a desperate need to understand what was happening in this place. That is when I found the nightmare that changed everything. In a hollow surrounded by thick brush, hidden from any casual observation, was a structure. An actual building, camouflaged with branches and vegetation, seemingly built directly into the hillside. The entrance was a dark opening in the earth, supported by wooden posts that looked new. I approached slowly, every instinct screaming at me to run. The eerie, creepy feeling of dread intensified with every step. The darkness in that opening seemed to absorb light. The air coming from inside smelled like earth and decay and something else, something chemical, something wrong. I looked inside the darkness and saw markings on the interior wall. More symbols, hundreds of them, covering every visible surface. Some were carved, some were painted in what I desperately hoped was paint but suspected was something far more horrifying. Then I saw something that froze my mind completely. A photograph, nailed to the wooden frame of the entrance. It was an old photograph, dated 1987. It showed Sheriff Douglas Hayes standing in front of Blood Creek, smiling, posed formally like he was being honored. But his eyes were wrong, empty, like something else was looking out through his face. I ran. I crashed through the brush, branches cutting my skin, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I ran all the way back to my truck, not stopping, not looking back, driven by pure primal fear. But the nightmare wasn't over. When I returned home that evening, I discovered that every photograph I'd taken had been deleted from my camera. Not corrupted, not lost, deliberately removed. The memory card showed no record of any images being stored, but I knew I'd taken them. I clearly remembered pressing the button, waiting for the shutter sound, watching the confirmation on the screen. The eerie, terrifying realization was that something had followed me out of that forest. Over the next week, I started noticing details that made my paranoia grow. My files about the Blood Creek investigation had been accessed. I could tell by the modification dates, even though I lived alone. My truck had been tampered with. The odometer showed mileage I didn't drive. Someone had been in my house. I could feel it. Little things were moved. Objects weren't quite where I left them. Then came the photographs. They started appearing on my doorstep. Old photographs, degraded by age, showing the clearing near Blood Creek. But they were taken from angles that shouldn't have existed in 1987. Modern angle, high-quality film stock, showing details of the forest that looked current. Each photograph showed more of a hidden structure. Each one showed it more clearly. The last photograph arrived yesterday. It showed the inside of the building, the symbols on the walls. And in the center of the image, standing perfectly still, hands at its sides, was a figure. A human shape but wrong, too tall, proportions slightly off, face obscured in shadow. On the back, written in handwriting that wasn't to mind, but somehow came from my own hand when I blacked out for 2 hours yesterday, were words. The rituals never stop. They evolved. They expanded. You read part of them now. Welcome home. I done. Do you know what is happening to me anymore? I done. Do you know if being haunted or hunted or something far more disturbing, something I lack the vocabulary to describe. The horrifying, chilling truth is that I went looking for a story and instead found something that was looking for me. I can feel it in my house, in my mind, in the spaces between my thoughts. The creepy, eerie sensation of being watched from inside my own skin. The Blood Creek rituals were sealed for a reason. They were sealed because they were never meant to be found. They were sealed because they were still happening. They re-spreading. And now that they look directly at them, now that they entered that clearing, part of whatever dark thing has been conducting those rituals for over 30 years. The scariest realization is this. I think they've been to that clearing before. I think they've been there many times. I think I'm forgetting those trips the way those officers forgot their investigation. I think something is using my hands to carve symbols when I'm not aware of it. I think the nightmare has already taken me, and it's using me to find others. Story 6. Children in the Dark. I found the bones of a child in the basement of an abandoned railway station, and that's when I realized the orphan train never actually stopped running. My name is Michael Porter, and I am a railroad historian. For 20 years, I've researched the history of American railways, written articles, given lectures at universities. I thought I knew the dark stories hidden in railroad history. I was wrong. What I discovered in the mountains of Kentucky was something so terrifying, so deeply disturbing, that I haven't slept properly in months. This is the true account of what happened. It started when I was researching the Appalachian orphan train routes from the early 1900s. The orphan trains were a real historical program where children from overcrowded urban orphanages were sent west to find families in labor. Most histories focus on the success stories, but the Appalachian routes were different. There were gaps in the records, missing documentation, train manifests that didn't match arrival reports, children listed as boarded who never appeared in any receiving town. The creepy part was discovering that over 400 children vanished without explanation across 3 railway lines through the Appalachian Mountains between 1902 and 1928. I became obsessed. I spent months in archives, tracing the routes, cross-referencing records, looking for evidence of what happened. The official explanations were vague. Some children supposedly ran away. Some died of illness and were buried in unmarked graves. Some were adopted by mountain families with no formal paperwork. The usual justifications for historical negligence and erased records. But the numbers didn't add up. 400 children was too many. The gaps were too consistent, and the eerie silence from the Appalachian communities was deafening. Then I found the journal of Edmund Ferris, written in 1929. Ferris was a railroad conductor who worked the mountain routes from 1902 to 1908. His journal had been donated to a university archive and was marked as non-historical, cataloged in a box labeled miscellaneous personal papers. Most historians would have skipped it. I didn't. Edmund Ferris described his work transporting orphans through the mountains. He described children who were sick, frightened, and malnourished. He described them packed into cargo cars meant for freight. He described the conditions as horrifying. But that wasn't the terrifying part. Ferris wrote about the stops the train made. Not at stations, off the tracks, in remote locations deep in the forest where no town existed. He described armed men boarding the train at night. Men from the mountains who would count the children, examine them like livestock, and then select certain ones. The terrifying details of his account came when he started to realize something was happening to the children who were selected. Something dark and unsettling. The selected children would be taken off the train. Ferris was instructed not to ask questions, not to record what happened, not to document the removals in any official capacity. When the train continued, those children were no longer on the manifests. Their names were simply erased, as if they never existed. Ferris wrote about hearing screams, about the sounds coming from deep in the forest where the selected children were taken, about the eerie silence that followed. He described growing paranoia and fear. He wrote about wanting to go to authorities but being afraid of what the mountain men might do, afraid of what knowledge he acquired. The most chilling entry was from 1907. Ferris wrote that he hidden himself near the drop-off point. He wanted to see what happened to the children. What he witnessed had traumatized him so deeply that he spent the next entry describing it in fragmentary, barely coherent sentences. He wrote about a clearing, about children being led deeper into the darkness, about figures that moved wrong, about shadows that seemed to have independent movement, about the horrible realization that the children weren't being taken to families or work. They were being taken to something else, something that existed in the darkness of the Appalachian Mountains. Ferris had stopped working the orphan train routes after that night. He spent the rest of his life in quiet terror, living alone, writing in his journal, documenting what he witnessed. His final entry suggested he knew he was being watched, that something from the mountains had noticed him, that it was only a matter of time before it came for him. Edmund Ferris died in 1951. The official cause was pneumonia, but his final journal entry, dated 3 weeks before his death, described him being unable to leave his house, being unable to go outside without sensing something waiting in the darkness, being unable to escape the memory of what he'd seen happening to those children. I sat in that archive room with his journal in my hands, and I felt the fear start to creep into my bones. I tried to convince myself it was just the paranoid ramblings of a traumatized man, the exaggerations of guilt mixed with fear, but the bones I would later find suggested otherwise. I decided to visit the actual route. I wanted to find the station where the removals happened, the eerie place where children had been taken into the darkness. Using Ferris' descriptions and old railway maps, I traced the location to a remote area outside a tiny town called Whisper Ridge, Tennessee. I rented a car and drove there. The abandoned station was still standing, though barely. A decrepit wooden structure that looked like it might collapse if you breathed on it. The platform was rotted. The rails were buried under decades of rust and dirt. The building itself smelled of decay and something else. Something organic. Something wrong. I explored the building carefully. Most of the interior was empty. Just a few rotting benches and scattered debris. But then I noticed a trapdoor in the floor, leading down to a basement beneath the station that I hadn't known existed. My heart was pounding as I pried it open. I descended into darkness so complete that my flashlight seemed to barely penetrate it. The basement was large, cold, and filled with something that made my skin crawl. There were marks on the walls, scratch marks, as if something had clawed at the stone. There were dark stains on the floor that could have been anything. But in the far corner, I found what made my entire understanding of history shift into nightmare. Bones. Small bones, dozens of them scattered across the floor. Bones that had been there for over 100 years. Bones of children. Some were arranged in patterns. Some were stacked deliberately, and carved into the basement walls, in crude letters, were names. Dozens of names, each name accompanied by a date, a year between 1902 and 1928. These were the names of the missing orphans. I documented everything. I took photographs. I called the authorities. But here, this is where the story becomes truly terrifying. When the police arrived, and when archaeologists and investigators came to examine the site, something happened that nobody could explain. The bones were gone. The names carved into the walls had vanished. The basement was empty except for dust and debris. The investigators accused me of fabricating the evidence, of faking photographs, of making up a story for attention. They said the marks on the walls were just natural patterns in the rock. They said I was paranoid and delusional. And when I insisted that I had photographs, I discovered that my camera had malfunctioned. Every single image had been corrupted, unusable, as if something had deliberately erased them. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew those bones were real, and I knew those names meant something. Something horrifying that someone or something wanted to keep hidden. I left Whisper Ridge shaken and afraid, but I couldn't stop researching. I became convinced that whatever happened to those children wasn't over. That something in those mountains had taken them, done something to them, and that whatever it was still there, still active, still taking things. I started researching similar disappearances throughout Appalachia, and I found them, dozens of them, cases of missing children, unusual deaths, communities that refused to talk about their histories. I found references to the eerie sounds that travelers reported hearing in certain sections of mountain trains. The screams of children coming from nowhere, the feeling of being watched while traveling through the tunnels, the inexplicable cold that descended when trains passed certain locations. Most horrifying was what I found in a private collection of old newspapers from a collector in North Carolina. An article from 1924 describing a passenger train that had derailed in a mountain tunnel. The official report said mechanical failure, but the real account, reported in a smaller publication before it was apparently suppressed, mentioned that passengers had seen children on the tracks. Children in tattered clothes standing in the middle of the rails. Children who shouldn't have been there. Children whose presence had caused the engineer to brake so hard the train lost control. The conductor who witnessed this reported seeing the children's faces clearly as the train crashed. He described their eyes, empty, hungry, not quite human anymore. The article was never reprinted. The newspaper ceased publication within months, and the conductor disappeared from public record entirely. I continued my research, though I know I shouldn't. I found too much, discovered too much, opened doors that were meant to stay sealed. And now something is happening that I can explain rationally, though they tried. I keep hearing children's voices. Not in my house, not in recordings, but in my mind, whispers that come at night, speaking names, speaking the locations of other abandoned stations, speaking directions to places deeper in the mountains where more of the dead are waiting. The voices sound hungry, and they know my name. Last week, I took a train through the Appalachian Mountains. Do you know why? Some compulsion I couldn't resist. As we entered a tunnel, I looked out the window and saw them. Dozens of small figures standing along the tracks. Children in clothing from the early 1900s. Their eyes were wrong, too dark, too aware, and they were all looking directly at me. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. And in that moment, I understood what happened to Edmund Ferris. I understood what happened to the 400 missing orphans. I understood what the men from the mountains had taken them to. They didn't take them to be killed. They took them to be changed, to be transformed into something else, something that exists in the darkness of the tunnels and the spaces between railway cars, something that feeds on the fear and confusion of travelers, something that has been waiting over 100 years for the railroad system to bring it more victims. The eerie truth is that the orphan train never actually stopped. It is still running, still transporting children through the darkness. The modern trains that go through those mountains today carry the descendants of those orphan trains, still moving through the same tunnels, still passing the same locations where the changes happen. I know this because I felt it happening to me. Every time I ride those trains, I can feel myself becoming less solid, less real. I can feel the hunger growing inside me, the need to call to others, the compulsion to sit on the tracks and wait for the next train, to become part of the eerie machinery that has been operating in the Appalachian darkness for over 100 years. I am writing this as a warning. If you ever have to take a train through the mountains, if you ever see children standing on the tracks where no children should be, do not look at them. Do not make eye contact. Because if you do, they know you can see them. And then they start speaking to you. And then you understand what happened to those 400 orphans. And then you understand that some trains never actually stop. They just keep circling through the darkness, collecting the lost and the lonely, adding them to the hunger that waits in the tunnels. I can hear them calling now, every night, getting closer, getting louder. Soon I'll have to go back to the tracks. Soon I'll have to take my place with all the other children who couldn't escape. And the terrifying part is that I'm no longer sure if I want to resist. Story 7. Fire on the ridge. The night an entire holler evacuated. I watched my home burn, and the fire didn't use any fuel I could see. My name is Catherine Webb. I am 61 years old, and I lived on Black Rock Ridge in eastern Kentucky my entire life. My family has been here for 4 generations. I thought I knew this mountain. I thought I understood what it meant to live in these hills. But on the night of August 22nd, I learned that some places don't want you to stay. The day started normal. Too normal, which I realize now was the first warning sign. The heat was oppressive, the kind of August heat that makes the air shimmer above the pavement. But the forest should have been alive with sound. Insects, birds, the normal chaos of a healthy ecosystem. Instead, there was silence, an eerie, creepy silence that made my skin crawl as I sat on my porch drinking coffee. By noon, I noticed something unsettling. The animals were leaving. Deer moved through the yards in the holler, heading downhill toward town. A bear that had been spotted the previous week appeared on the ridge, walking parallel to the mountain road, moving away from the higher elevations. Even the birds had vanished. The trees were completely still, sound-free, as if nature itself was holding its breath. I called my neighbor, Pete Garland, who lived here just as long as I had. He said the same thing was happening at his place. Something terrifying was making every living thing flee the ridge. We made jokes about it, trying to laugh away the creeping fear. But both of us knew something was wrong. By late afternoon, I felt the temperature change. The heat didn't diminish. Instead, it became localized. Certain areas of my property were noticeably hotter than others, as if invisible fires were burning in the space around my home. The air itself felt wrong, heavy with smoke that I couldn't see. When I checked my thermometer, it read 98 degrees, but my skin felt like it was being slow roasted in an oven. I started preparing to leave. I packed important documents, family photos, irreplaceable items. My hands were shaking, and I wasn't too sure why. The fear was building like a pressure in my chest, but I had no logical explanation for it. There were no visible signs of fire, no smell of smoke, just this horrifying sensation that something terrifying was approaching. Around 6 o'clock, I heard sirens in the distance. Then more sirens. Many more. I went outside, and I could see emergency vehicles moving up the mountain road, heading toward the ridge. The nightmare became real when I looked across the holler and saw fire. Not on anything, not consuming buildings or trees or structures. The fire was floating in the air, patches of flame moving through the forest like something alive, like something intelligent. The fire wasn't spreading from a point source. It was appearing spontaneously across the mountainside, multiple fires igniting simultaneously in locations that had no connection to each other. I watched in horror as fires bloomed across the ridge. One ignited in the middle of the road. Another burst into existence in this yard. Another consumed the empty space between my cabin and the next property. They weren't following the normal pattern of spreading fire. They were manifesting independently, as if someone invisible was placing them strategically across the holler. The fear became absolute when I realized that the fires weren't burning anything. Trees stood untouched by flame. Buildings remained intact despite fires burning directly beside them. The fire was there but wasn't there. It was terrifying, a chilling violation of everything I understood about how fire worked. It was like watching a nightmare made visible, a disturbing manifestation of danger that couldn't be fought or escaped. The emergency response came fast. Firefighters and police arrived within minutes, and the moment they saw what was happening, I could see the shock on their faces. They radioed for additional units. They called for evacuation orders. Within 30 minutes, the sheriff was going door to door telling everyone to leave. Immediately. No time to pack. Leave your home and get to lower elevation. I grabbed what I'd already packed and drove down the mountain with my neighbors. The road was chaos. Every resident of the holler was fleeing at once, taillights creating a river of red down the winding mountain pass. Behind us, the fires multiplied. I watched in my rearview mirror as more flames ignited across the ridge, burning in the darkness without consuming anything, spreading across the mountainside in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. We made it to the valley, and we stopped at a church parking lot where the emergency command center had been set up. Firefighters were coordinating responses, but I could see the confusion on their faces. Nobody knew how to fight fires that didn't burn. Nobody knew how to evacuate an area from a threat that didn't follow physical laws. By midnight, the entire holler had been evacuated. Every resident was accounted for. No deaths, thankfully, but complete displacement. We were being directed to shelters in neighboring towns, told that we could return once the fires were extinguished and the area declared safe. But the fires never went out. Days passed. The fires remained burning across Black Rock Ridge, unchanged and uncontrolled. Firefighters attempted to reach them, but every time they approached, the fires would move. Not spread, move, teleporting to new locations, always staying just beyond reach. The television coverage was intense for about a week, then the story disappeared. Network news moved on to other disasters. That's when the government acquisition began. Within 2 weeks of the evacuations, federal agents arrived in our small town. They told us that the land was being seized under eminent domain. The fires had made the area too unstable, they said. Dangerous for residents. The government was purchasing all properties on Black Rock Ridge at fair market value. We had options. Accept the buyout or file for legal action that would likely take years. Most people took the money. What choice did we have? We couldn't go home. The fires were still burning. The mountainside was declared a disaster zone. The government was offering fair compensation. By the end of September, over 90% of us had signed away our properties. I was among the holdouts at first. I wanted to know the truth. I hired a lawyer and demanded access to the property to assess damage and attempt recovery. After 3 months of legal maneuvering, I got my access. I was allowed to visit Black Rock Ridge with a federal escort. A young agent named Morrison accompanied me to my cabin. What I found was impossible. The fires were completely gone. Not extinguished. Gone. No burn marks. No ash. No evidence that any fire had ever touched the ridge. The cabin was untouched, just as I left it on that terrifying night. But something had changed about the place. The air felt different, colder. The forest around my home was different too. The trees were dying. Not burned, dying. Their leaves were brown despite it being late autumn when they should still be green. The soil looked wrong, almost like it had been replaced with something similar but fundamentally different. The most unsettling discovery was in the basement of my cabin. Scorch marks, not from fire burning down from above, from underneath, from the earth itself, as if something had been burning from below the foundation, from deep in the ground, and had stopped burning only when we evacuated. When I asked Agent Morrison about this, his expression changed. He went very quiet, and then he said something I'll never forget. He said, "Ms. Webb, you don't want to know what is under this mountain. You really don't. Take the government offer and move on with your life." That is when I understood. The fires weren't accidental. The government wasn't here to help us. They were here to clear us out. Whatever had been burning under Black Rock Ridge, whatever was causing fires to manifest in the air itself, the government knew about it and wanted the land for reasons they couldn't share. I took the buyout. I relocated to a small apartment in Knoxville, and I tried to forget about Black Rock Ridge. But the fear and the knowledge never left me. Over the following year, I did research. I found similar incidents across the Appalachian region. Unexplained fires in remote areas. Mass evacuations. Government land acquisition. All of them followed the same pattern. All of them happened in places that people had lived for generations. All of them resulted in the government gaining control of mountainous terrain with no public explanation. What I discovered in the research was the chilling truth. The fires weren't random. They were systematic. They appeared in areas where people lived on government-targeted land. The fires were being used as tools for displacement, create unexplainable danger, force evacuation, acquire the land, and maintain secrecy about whatever actually caused the fires. The most horrifying realization came when I found satellite imagery from before the fires. I examined thermal imaging of Black Rock Ridge from months before the evacuation. The heat signatures didn't match normal geology. There were patterns deep underground. Geometric patterns, arranged in ways that suggested intentional structure. The fires weren't caused by anything on the surface. They were being created from below, and the government knew about it. They'd been monitoring it, waiting for it to become visible, using it as a reason to claim the land. I've spent the last 3 years trying to understand what is actually under those mountains. The answer terrifies me more than the fires ever did. The patterns I found in the thermal imaging match archaeological surveys that were conducted in the 60s and 70s by people who worked for government agencies. Those surveys documented unusual geological structures throughout the Appalachian region. Structures that didn't match any known natural formation. Structures that looked like they'd been deliberately buried centuries ago. The fires, I believe, are something else waking up. Something that was buried under that mountain for generations. Something that the government has known about for decades. And something that started becoming active enough to manifest as physical fire that could be seen. I received letters from other evacuees. People from other hollers where similar fires occurred. They all report the same thing. The land feels wrong now. The new owners never actually use it. Government agencies maintain restricted zones. And occasionally, people report seeing fires burning in the distance, in those government-controlled areas, burning the same way the fires burned in my holler. The chilling truth I've come to understand is that the evacuations weren't the end. They were the beginning. The government is clearing people off these mountains not to protect them, but to have exclusive access to whatever is beneath them. Whatever is waking up, whatever is creating fires that don't burn anything because they were not actually fire at all. They re-manifestations of something that exists in the space between our world and somewhere else. Something that the government has known about for generations. Something that our presence interferes with, which is why the fires appear when we build homes, when we settle, when we try to live on top of it. I sometimes drive past the ridge from a distance. At night, I can see the eerie glow on the mountainside. Fires burning in the darkness where no fires should exist. Burning in government-controlled land where no one else is allowed to go. And I know that eventually, those fires will spread beyond the restricted zones. Eventually, whatever they represent will become too large to contain. Eventually, more evacuation orders will come. More homes will be abandoned. More land will be seized. The horrifying truth is that this isn't about clearing one holler. It is about managing a slow and systematic evacuation of an entire region. One community at a time. One fire at a time. Until every person has been removed from the mountains, and the government has exclusive control over whatever lies beneath them. I am 64 now. I've lost my home, my community, and my certainty about the world. But I am alive. I am safe. And that is more than I can say for the people who will refuse to evacuate when the fires come to their mountains. Because they will come. I have no doubt about that. The fire on the ridge wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. And all across the Appalachian Mountains, in the darkness beneath the earth, something is waking up. Something that creates fire without burning. Something that the government will use to slowly, systematically evacuate an entire region. By the time people understand what is happening, it will be too late to resist. The mountains will be empty, and the fires will continue burning in the darkness, marking the presence of something terrifying that we were never meant to live on top of. Story 8. Sealed room. Room 237 at the Ridgeline Motel doesn't exist anymore, but I know it still exists. My name is Carl Daniels, and I've spent the last 3 years trying to forget what I found inside that room. I work in property management, handling renovation projects for hotel chains across Appalachia. It is steady work, boring mostly, until the day my company acquired the Ridgeline Motel in Harlan County, Kentucky, and I discovered why a perfectly good room had been sealed off, renumbered, and completely removed from the booking system. The Ridgeline is a typical roadside motel, the kind you see scattered along highways across America. 2 stories, maybe 40 rooms, office in the front, a small diner attached. The building is probably from the 1970s, worn but functional. When we took over the property, I was assigned to assess what needed renovation. Most of the rooms were standard. Tired carpet, outdated furniture, ancient bathroom fixtures. Standard motel stuff, but one section of the second floor was different. The hallway leading to rooms 235 through 240 had been sealed with drywall. The door frames were completely covered, completely hidden. When I asked the previous manager about it, his response was eerie and disturbing. He told me that section had been closed after an incident and never reopened. He told me I shouldn't try to remove the drywall. He told me to leave those rooms alone. When I asked what incident, he wouldn't explain further. He just said that whatever happened there was the reason he was selling the motel and leaving Appalachia entirely. The chilling part was the way he said it, like he was warning me about something dangerous. I became obsessed with that sealed section. I started researching the motel's history, digging through old newspaper archives and police records. That is when I found this story. In 1994, a man had been found dead in room 237. The official cause was listed as an overdose, a routine drug death that happened in motels across the country. The case was closed quickly. The death was unremarkable, but the terrifying details buried in police reports told a different story. The body had been discovered by housekeeping staff, and their reaction had been so severe that one worker required hospitalization for shock. The officer's notes described the room as containing something disturbing enough that a state investigator had been called. The follow-up investigation resulted in the room being sealed by court order. All evidence had been removed. The room was taken off the rental roster and simply left empty. The eerie, creepy part was that the next entry in the public records showed that room 237 had been renumbered to room 341 on the ground floor 3 years later. The space behind the drywall had never been used again. It was simply walled off and forgotten. I needed to see what was behind that drywall. I obtained permission from ownership to begin renovation planning, and I hired contractors to carefully remove the drywall covering the sealed hallway. When we opened it up, the air that came out was stale and wrong, thick with the smell of decay and something chemical, something that made my eyes water. The hallway was exactly as it had been left nearly 30 years ago. Dust lay thick on every surface. Spiderwebs decorated the corners, but what struck me immediately was the darkness. Even with our construction lights, the hallway seemed to absorb light. The shadows under the doors felt wrong, felt occupied, felt like they were watching us work. Room 237 was the first door on the left. The lock had corroded, so we had to force it open. The door swung inward slowly, creaking on hinges that seemed reluctant to move. The interior was darkness and decay and something eerie that I couldn't quite name. The window was covered completely by a heavy blanket that had rotted away in places, allowing thin streams of daylight through gaps that revealed the room in fragmented pieces. My contractors refused to enter. They stood in the hallway and watched as I stepped inside alone. The nightmare details assaulted my senses immediately. The carpet was stained with patterns that suggested liquid had soaked into it repeatedly. The walls bore marks, streaks and smears that made my stomach turn. On the far wall, above the bed, was a pattern of discoloration that looked intentional, deliberate, like something had been written there in a substance that had long since faded. But the most terrifying discovery was the bathroom. The mirror had been shattered at some point, leaving sharp fragments still embedded in the frame. The tub was stained a deep brown that no amount of time could explain. And on the tile wall above the tub, carved deeply into the porcelain, were symbols. Not scratches, carved, deliberate, eerie geometric patterns that hurt to look at too long. I took photographs of everything. I documented the room methodically, professionally, trying to maintain distance from the creepy, unsettling atmosphere that seemed to be pressing against me from every direction. But as I was photographing the bathroom, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were fingernail marks in the dried substance coating the tub, deep, desperate scratches in the material, as if someone had been clawing at the surface while the substance was still wet. The scratches were numerous and frantic, suggesting a prolonged struggle, a sustained effort to escape something horrifying. The terrifying realization was that I was looking at evidence that had been left undisturbed for nearly 3 decades. I called the police and reported my findings. A detective arrived within an hour and examined the room with the kind of expression that told me he recognized something in those symbols, something meaningful and disturbing. He told me the room needed to stay sealed. He told me to not discuss what I found with anyone. He told me to hire a contractor to remove all evidence and seal the room permanently. He also told me something chilling that he probably shouldn't have. He said that in 1994, when room 237 had first been sealed, the police had consulted with specialists, historians, religious scholars, experts in unusual crimes. All of them had recommended that the room be destroyed completely. Not renovated, destroyed. The building should have been demolished, they said, but local ownership had refused. The eerie, unsettling implication was that whatever had happened in that room was serious enough that experts believed the space itself carried some kind of danger. I decided to find out who had died in room 237. The body had been identified as a man named Russell Holbrook, a transient who rented the room for 1 week. Police records showed no next of kin, no identification beyond a driver, his license, no family to claim the body. He'd simply been cremated and forgotten. The motel staff from 1994 were scattered, some dead, some relocated, most unwilling to discuss the incident when I finally managed to track them down. But one person talked to me. She was a housekeeper named Dorothy Mills, now in her 80s, living in a care facility. When I mentioned room 237, her entire body went rigid. Her hands started shaking. She told me she'd been the one who found the body. She told me that what she'd seen in that room had fundamentally broken something inside her that never healed. She said Russell Holbrook had overdosed. She said he'd been found in the bathtub surrounded by carved symbols. She said his body showed evidence of self-mutilation, deep cuts covering every inch of skin, arranged in patterns that matched the symbols on the walls. She said his final act had been to carve those same symbols into the bathtub itself, presumably with his own fingernails after exhausting whatever tool he'd been using. The chilling part came when she told me what those symbols meant. She said the police had consulted with an expert who identified them as belonging to an ancient ritual tradition. A tradition that involved self-harm and self-sacrifice. A tradition that practitioners believed opened doorways to something unseen. Something that existed in the spaces between reality. The eerie implication was that Russell Holbrook hadn't been a random overdose death. He'd been conducting a ritual. He'd been attempting to invite something into our world. And according to Dorothy, he might have succeeded. She told me that after the room was sealed, strange things happened at the motel. Guests reported hearing sounds from the sealed section, screaming, scratching, sounds of something moving in the darkness. The staff refused to work that section. The owner started losing business. Eventually, the entire area had been walled off and the room completely eliminated from the motel's existence. But the nightmare didn't end there. Guests continued reporting disturbances, not from the sealed section specifically, but from other rooms. Nightmares, disturbing visions, a sensation of being watched. People would check out in the middle of the night, terrified and unable to articulate why. Some reported hearing voices in the darkness. Others claimed to see shadows moving in ways that violated natural physics. Within 5 years, the Ridgeline's reputation had been destroyed. Only desperate travelers stayed there. The occupancy rate dropped to nearly nothing. The owner, desperate to escape the nightmare, eventually sold to a corporate chain that tried standard remediation. But nothing worked. The disturbing presence remained. The fear persisted. Guests continued having experiences they couldn't explain, until the corporate chain decided to simply ignore the problem. Renumber the room. Remove it from systems. Pretend it didn't exist. I should have listened to that advice. After discovering the truth about room 237, I made the mistake of returning to the motel alone. I told myself I was conducting final documentation. I told myself I needed to understand what had happened. The eerie, creepy compulsion to see that room again overrode my better judgment. I went inside at night. The sealed section was empty except for the darkness and the rawness that seemed to emanate from every wall. I opened room 237 and stepped inside, armed with a flashlight and a sense of dread that was almost overwhelming. The room was exactly as I left it. The marks on the walls, the stained carpet, the carved symbols in the bathroom. But something had changed. The symbols on the wall above the bathtub appeared fresher, newer, like they'd been recarved recently. And in the mirror that I documented as shattered, I could see a reflection of something standing behind me. A shape that shouldn't have been there. A form that was too tall, too wrong. Its face obscured in shadow despite my flashlight pointing directly at it. I ran. I crashed out of the room and down the hallway, my fear overriding all rational thought. But as I was leaving, I heard something that made my blood freeze. A voice, not coming from behind me but seemingly coming from inside my own head. A voice that sounded like my own voice but speaking words I wasn't thinking. The voice said, "You've seen the doorway. Now the doorway sees you." I didn't go back to the motel. I called my supervisor and quit my job. I spent the last 3 years moving constantly, unable to stay in one place for long. Because I started experiencing the same disturbing phenomena that the motel guests had reported. Nightmares so vivid they felt real. Visions of symbols appearing on surfaces around me. The constant sensation of being watched by something that exists in the spaces between perception. The horrifying, terrifying truth is that I can feel it getting closer. Something entered our world through room 237 in 1994. Russell Holbrook opened a doorway, and what came through has been spreading ever since. It spreads through the motel, through the town, through everyone who enters that space and sees what shouldn't be seen. And I am terrified that by documenting the room, by taking photographs, by trying to understand what happened there, I've made myself a new vector for its expansion. Last night, I found symbols carved into my own skin while I was sleeping. Symbols I don't remember making. Symbols that match the ones in room 237. The eerie, chilling realization is that something is using my hands now. Something is marking me as a doorway. The scariest part is knowing that wherever I go, I am bringing it with me. Room 237 doesn't need to exist anymore. It has escaped. It is spreading. And everyone I've told about what I found is infected with knowledge of the doorway. Everyone who hears this story is a potential new location for it to manifest. The horror isn't sealed in that room anymore. The horror is loose in the world, and it is looking for the next person to open a doorway. Story 9. Hollow Man. I've seen him in 7 different places across 4 different counties, and each time I get closer to understanding that he isn't actually there at all. My name is Detective Sarah Mitchell, and I've spent the last 3 years chasing a ghost that everyone insists is real. What they discovered about this man, or whatever he is, has shattered my understanding of criminal investigation and touched something deeply terrifying about the nature of reality itself. This is the true account of the Hollow Man of Appalachia, and every detail will haunt you. It started in March of 2019 with a string of brutal assaults across 3 rural counties in eastern Kentucky. A woman attacked in her home. A man assaulted on a mountain road. A store clerk beaten during a robbery. Nothing connecting the incidents except one detail that became increasingly eerie. Every single witness described the same man, The descriptions were unsettling in their consistency. Tall, thin, wearing dark clothes. But there was something wrong with how people described him. They couldn't quite focus on his face. They described his eyes as empty. His movements as wrong somehow. Jerky, unnatural. Several witnesses mentioned feeling an inexplicable dread when they looked at him. A creeping fear that transcended normal criminal violence. A sense that they weren't being attacked by a human being at all. We had no problem identifying him because there were security cameras. Video footage from 3 different locations showing the same man committing the crimes. Clear images, good detail, unmistakable evidence. We ran his image through every database. FBI facial recognition, state police files, local records. Nothing, not a single match. The system had no record of him existing. This was where things started becoming truly disturbing. We showed the photographs to locals, people who lived in those communities their entire lives. They all said the same thing. They'd seen him before, multiple times, over the course of years, in different locations across different counties, always doing something frightening, always leaving a wake of fear and violence. But nobody could ever get a solid identification. Nobody could ever describe his face in enough detail to actually identify him. Then we started finding the old reports. Incident reports from 2005 described a man matching the exact same description. From 1998, from 1989, from 1974. Always the same description. Always the same eerie inability for witnesses to focus on identifying features. Always the same creepy pattern of violence spreading across rural Appalachia like a nightmare that kept recurring. My supervisor thought we were dealing with a serial killer who had been operating for decades. A man who somehow managed to avoid capture through sheer luck and the isolation of rural mountain communities. That made sense from a logical standpoint. Serial killers were real. They could operate for years without being caught. But something about this case felt different. Something felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. That was before I met the Hollow Man myself. I was investigating a lead in a remote area near the Tennessee border. A woman had reported a break-in attempt at her isolated cabin, and she described the same man from all the other incidents. I drove out to interview her, and the horror started immediately when I arrived at her property. She was terrified. Not the normal fear of having been violated by a criminal. This was something deeper. Something that looked like she encountered something that had shaken her understanding of reality. She told me she woken at 3 a.m. to find him standing in her bedroom. Just standing there, watching her. She screamed and he run. But here is what made it terrifying. She said she looked directly at his face. She seen his eyes, and she described something that made my blood run cold. She said his face was empty, like looking at a photograph with the features removed. Like something was there, but nothing was showing. She said his eyes had no color, no iris or pupil, just dark spaces where eyes should be. And when he ran, she said he moved wrong, his limbs bending in directions that human limbs shouldn't bend. I tried to rationalize it. Terror and darkness could distort perception. The mind could play tricks when you were frightened. But as I looked at her face, I saw a genuine horror. Not exaggeration, not hysteria, but the terrified expression of someone who encountered something that defied natural explanation. I stayed at her cabin that night. I set up surveillance equipment. I wanted to document what people were seeing. If the Hollow Man was real, I would catch him on camera. If he wasn't real, if this was some kind of mass delusion or panic, I would prove it. He came at 2:47 in the morning. I was in the living room, monitoring the cameras, when every single monitor went dark simultaneously. The equipment died. The power failed. The backup battery system shut down for no reason. I heard the noise first. A sound like something dragging itself across the floor. Wet, organic, wrong. Then I heard breathing. Not human breathing. Something that sounded like wind through a tunnel. Something ancient and hollow. I turned on my flashlight and saw him. He was standing in the hallway, maybe 15 feet away. Tall, impossibly tall. His proportions seemed off, too elongated. His clothes hung on his frame like they were on a scarecrow. And his face was everything the witnesses had described and worse. There was nothing there, not darkness or obscured features. Just nothing. Like looking at a void wearing a human shape. I couldn't focus on him. My eyes would start to settle on his face and then slip away like oil on water. I drew my weapon. My training kicked in and I aimed directly at the center of his mass. I should have fired. Every protocol, every instinct, every second of law enforcement training screamed at me to shoot. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by something deeper than fear. something primal, something that recognized that the normal rules of violence didn't apply to whatever was standing in front of me. The terrifying thing that happened next was that he tilted his head, just slightly, and I understood, with absolute certainty, that he was looking at me, studying me, and I felt something touch my mind. Not physically, but intellectually, like something was reaching into my consciousness and examining my thoughts. It was the most violating, horrifying sensation I've ever experienced. Then he moved, and I am not going to describe how he moved because there aren't words for it. Imagine something that doesn't follow the normal rules of physics. Imagine something that was in the hallway and then suddenly was closer and then suddenly was right in front of me. I fired my weapon. The gunshot was deafening in that small space. I was certain I'd hit him, but he was still there, still standing, still tilting his head. I ran out of that cabin into the darkness, and I kept running until I reached my car. I drove to the nearest town and sat in a police station until dawn. When I went back to check on the woman the next morning, she was catatonic. She'd been committed to a psychiatric facility. The official diagnosis was acute schizophrenia brought on by stress. But I knew the truth. She'd seen him too. She had the experience I had, and her mind couldn't process it. I continued investigating, but I changed my approach. Instead of looking for the hollow man, I started looking at the pattern, the incidents, the locations, the timeline, and I discovered something that was even more eerie than encountering him in person. I discovered that the hollow man wasn't actually moving through space in a linear way. He was appearing in places where his appearances created maximum fear, maximum disruption, maximum psychological damage. It was like he was hunting, not for victims, for witnesses, for people to experience his presence. And every person who saw him was transformed by it, changed by the knowledge that something non-human was operating in their communities. I found psychiatric records, hidden behind privacy laws, but I found them. 37 people over the past 40 years who had encounters matching the hollow man description. All of them had been diagnosed with severe trauma-related mental illness. All of them had eventually either taken their own lives or had spent the rest of their lives in psychiatric facilities unable to communicate what they experienced. The most chilling thing I discovered was that the incidents were accelerating. They happened sporadically in the 70s and 80s, more frequently in the 90s, regularly in the 2000s, and now they were almost constant. Multiple sightings per month, multiple counties, multiple witnesses. It was like something was happening, like the hollow man was becoming more real, more present, more solid in our world, or like our world was becoming more like his, more hollow, less substantial, less real. Vic tried to explain this to my supervisor. Vic tried to explain it to the FBI. Vic tried to explain it to psychiatrists and paranormal investigators and anyone who would listen. Most of them think I'm suffering from occupational stress or trauma from the initial encounter. Some suggest I am having a psychotic break. One psychologist suggested that I am confabulating memories, creating an elaborate narrative to make sense of an encounter that my mind can actually process. But I know what I saw, and I know that the hollow man is still out there, still appearing, still transforming people through the horror of his presence. The terrifying realization I've become to is that I'm becoming like him. Every time I think about him, every time I investigate these incidents, I feel myself becoming less substantial, less real. I look in the mirror and I am not entirely sure I'm seeing a complete reflection. I've started noticing that people have difficulty focusing on my face when I'm speaking, that they describe vague details when asked about me, that my presence seems to create inexplicable dread in those around me. I think he is infecting people through observation, through witness, through the act of trying to understand him. I think everyone who has studied him long enough is becoming like him, becoming hollow, becoming less real, becoming part of whatever machinery of darkness he is operating. My final entry in this account is to warn you, if you ever hear the description, if you ever see the footage, if you ever encounter a man who doesn't quite seem real, Don, to look at him, Don, to try to understand him, Don, to let him into your mind, because once he is there, you'll all start to fade. You'll all start to become hollow. And eventually, you will be like me, like him, existing in the spaces between reality, hunting for other witnesses, spreading the horrible knowledge that something is fundamentally wrong with the nature of existence in Appalachia. The hollow man I sent to hunting us, we re-becoming him. And the eerie truth is that there There's nothing I can do to stop it. I can feel myself disappearing, with each breath, with each moment, becoming less real, less here. And the creeping horror is that I'm not entirely sure I want to come back. Story 10. Preacher is hollow. I should have left Harlan County the moment my truck broke down on that empty mountain road. But I didn't. And now, 3 years later, I'm still haunted by what I discovered in that terrifying place. What I'm about to tell you is true. Every single word. It was October, the kind of autumn when the Appalachian Mountains turn blood red and orange, and the air gets so cold at night that you can see your breath hanging like ghosts in front of your face. I was driving through Kentucky, heading to a salvage yard in Lynch to pick up parts for my contracting business. I made this drive 100 times. Never again would I take that road. The breakdown happened around 4 in the afternoon. My old Chevy just died. No warning, no sputtering. One moment I was driving through dense forest, and the next, my engine went completely silent. I coasted onto the shoulder, popped the hood, and found nothing obviously wrong. No mechanic in the next town over. Preacher is hollow. Population maybe 300. Could see me until tomorrow morning. So I did what any sensible person would do. I grabbed my bag from the truck and started walking toward the town, figuring I could find a motel for the night. What I didn't know is that I was about to stumble onto something deeply disturbing. Something that locals had been keeping secret for decades. Something that would make me question everything I thought I understood about evil, darkness, and how easily normal people can participate in unspeakable horrors. The town appeared through the trees like something from a nightmare. Old brick buildings, weathered and cracked, lined a main street that looked completely abandoned. It was late afternoon, maybe 5 o'clock, but the streets were empty. No cars, no people, just wind moving through dead leaves. The silence was so thick I could feel it pressing against my chest. This was the kind of place where something had gone deeply wrong, the kind of place where bad things had happened and nobody wanted to talk about them. I found a motel called the Mountain View. The name was a lie. You couldn't see any mountain from there, just thick forest and darkness creeping in from all sides. The front desk clerk was an older woman with sad eyes who barely looked at me when I asked for a room. She handed me a key without speaking, just pointed up the stairs. Her silence felt intentional, knowing, like she was deciding whether to warn me about something. As I climbed the stairs, I heard something that made my skin crawl. Church bells ringing, not from far away, but close, very close. I looked out the hallway window and there it was, sitting on a hill just beyond the tree line. An old white church, the kind you see in horror stories and true crime documentaries. But something was different about this one. It felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The church seemed to be watching the town, watching me. That night, I lay in my motel room listening to sounds I couldn't identify. Footsteps in the hallway, doors opening and closing at odd hours. Once, around midnight, I heard what sounded like singing coming from the direction of the church. But the singing was wrong, off-key, distorted, like voices recorded and played backward. I pulled a thin blanket over my head like a child and told myself I was being paranoid. Just a small town, just old buildings settling, just the wind. But I knew I was lying to myself. The next morning, I walked to a diner to grab coffee before checking on my truck. The place was crowded with local men, all of them staring at me the moment I walked through the door. Their eyes followed me to a booth in the back. Nobody spoke. It was the most eerie, unsettling feeling. Like I walked into a room where everyone knew something I didn't. Something dangerous. An old man sitting alone at the counter eventually came over. He was thin, weathered, with skin like leather and eyes that had seen terrible things. He sat down across from me without being invited. He told me I should leave Preacher. It's hollow. Today, right now, get my truck fixed elsewhere if I had to. He said the town wasn't too safe for visitors. When I asked him what he meant, he just stood up and walked away. Nobody at the diner would make eye contact after that. But I was stubborn. I was also curious. And curiosity, I would learn, is a dangerous thing when you in a place where people are hiding something horrifying. After getting my truck fixed, I should have driven straight out of town. Instead, I found myself driving up to that white church on the hill. I told myself I just wanted to take a look at the architecture. But deep down, I knew I was drawn there by something darker. Something was calling to me, pulling me toward the truth. The church was called the Holiness of the Eternal Flame, according to the weathered sign out front. The building was old, maybe built in the 1890s, but recently maintained. The white paint was fresh. The front doors were solid oak, and they were locked. That was strange. Most old churches out in rural areas are open during the day, but these doors were secured with heavy chains and a padlock that looked expensive and new. I walked around to the side, peering through the windows. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. The pews had been removed. The altar had been covered with a dark cloth, and on the floor, arranged in a perfect circle, were names written in white chalk. Dozens of names, too many to count from where I was standing. Children, names. Women, names. Names that had been written there deliberately. Carefully. My hands were shaking. I pulled out my phone to take a picture, and that is when I heard the voice. It came from behind me, from somewhere in the dark woods beyond the church. You shouldn't be looking at that. I spun around, heart pounding. An old woman was standing at the edge of the forest, watching me. She wore dark clothes and her white hair was pinned back tightly. Her face was deeply lined, and her expression was one of profound sadness mixed with something that looked like fear. I tried to act casual, but my voice cracked. I asked her what the names meant. She looked around, as if checking to make sure nobody was listening. Then she walked closer, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. She told me that the preacher, his hollow church, had not always been called that. In the early 1970s, a man named Elijah Thorne had come to this town and started the church. He was charismatic, persuasive, and he quickly built a congregation of desperate people. Poor families, isolated communities, people looking for salvation. He promised them miracles. He promised them protection. He promised them that they were part of something sacred. But the church was not about salvation. It was about control and power and the worst kind of evil imaginable. Over the course of 10 years, Elijah Thorne and his inner circle of devoted followers began to abuse the children in the congregation. They documented it. They hid the evidence. They threatened anyone who tried to speak out. The county sheriff was paid to stay silent. The local government records were altered. Disappearances were covered up. Parents who questioned the church as activities found themselves isolated, threatened, or worse. The woman told me that there was a sealed basement beneath the church, a place where things happened that the town had collectively agreed to forget. Things so horrifying that even 3 decades later, locals refused to speak about them. She said that in 1982, federal investigators had come to investigate after a girl escaped and reported what was happening. But by the time they arrived, most of the evidence was gone. The children had been moved. Witnesses had been paid or frightened into silence. But Elijah Thorne had never been prosecuted. He had died in 1987 in his home on the property. The church had passed to his successor. The abuse had continued. The woman, his eyes were filled with tears as she spoke. She told me her daughter's name had been among those written on the church floor. That her daughter was one of the missing children. That her daughter's disappearance had been ruled a runaway case, even though she was only 9 years old. That no amount of pleading or investigation had ever brought her home. Then she told me something that made my entire body go numb with terror. She said that every night after midnight, the church doors unlocked themselves. That locals had seen lights in the church windows at night. Lights that shouldn't be there because the building had no working electricity. That sometimes, late at night, people reported hearing children crying coming from inside the sealed basement. Children who shouldn't have been there. Children who had been missing for 30, 40, even 50 years. She said the church was still choosing victims. That people in the town had learned to keep their children inside after dark. That they had learned to pretend not to notice when someone went missing. That they had learned to live with the nightmare because the alternative was confronting what had been allowed to happen under their watch. Before I could ask her anything else, she turned and walked back into the forest. I called after her, but she didn't turn around. She just disappeared into the darkness between the trees. I drove back into town in a daze. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel. Every rational part of my brain was telling me that the woman was either crazy or lying. That I had let my imagination run away with me. That small towns have gossip and rumors, and sometimes those rumors are just stories. Sometimes they were not real, but something inside me knew she was telling the truth. I spent the rest of the day in the diner, ordering coffee I didn't to drink and pretending to read a newspaper. I was waiting to see if anyone would come talk to me. Waiting to see if anyone would try to stop me from asking questions. The men from that morning never approached me again. They just watched, occasional glances over their shoulders, Whispered conversations that stopped the moment I looked up. At sunset, I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I decided to go back to the church after midnight. I decided I was going to try those doors. I decided I was going to find out if what the woman had told me was real or just the rambling of someone broken by grief. I spent the evening in my motel room, waiting for the hours to pass. At midnight, I got in my truck and drove back to the church. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. My mouth was dry. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around and drive away. But I didn't. I parked my truck on the road, turned off the engine, and walked toward that white building in the darkness. The night was so dark I could barely see my own feet. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds. The only sound was the wind through the trees and the blood rushing in my ears. When I reached the front doors, I put my hand on the cold metal of the padlock. My fingers were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. The padlock was open, not unlocked by someone else. It was hanging there, loose, like it had never been closed at all. The chains fell away easily when I pulled on them. The oak doors swung inward on silent hinges, and a smell came pouring out of the darkness inside. A smell of mold and decay and something else. Something that made my stomach heave and my eyes water. It was the smell of old blood mixed with human waste. The smell of a place where terrible suffering had occurred. I stood at the threshold, unable to move, unable to breathe. The darkness inside the church was absolute and suffocating. It seemed to have weight and substance, like I was looking at a wall of black. But I could hear things moving in that darkness. I could hear what sounded like footsteps on wooden floors. I could hear breathing that wasn't mine. And then I heard it, clear as day. A child, this voice. It came from somewhere deep inside the church, from somewhere far below, from that basement the woman had mentioned. The voice was singing a nursery rhyme, a twisted, wrong version of a lullaby that children shouldn't know. The voice sounded young, maybe 5 or 6 years old, but there was something ancient about it, something that had endured far too long in darkness and pain. I stepped backward. I stepped backward very quickly, and I ran. I ran to my truck, started the engine, and drove out of Preacher is Hollow at 2 in the morning. I drove for 12 hours straight without stopping. I never went back for my tools that were still at the mechanic's shop. I never reported what I seen to any authority. I was too afraid of what would happen if I brought official attention to that place. Afraid of what the people in that town might do if I became a liability. But I couldn't stay silent either. The image of that open padlock haunts me. The sound of that child's voice singing in the darkness won't leave my mind. I think about the woman who lost her daughter. I think about all the children whose names were written on that church floor. I think about all the people in that town who go to bed every night knowing what happened under their noses. Knowing that evil was protected. Knowing that justice never came. So I am telling you this story, not as a warning. It is too late for warnings. But as a confession, as an act of bearing witness to something too horrible to ignore. That church is still there. Those children are still missing. And the locals are still keeping their silence. The Preacher is Hollow church still locks its doors after midnight. But as I learned, those locks are only meant to keep people from entering. To keep the world from seeing what happens in the darkness. The terrifying truth is this. There are places in America where evil has taken root so deeply that entire communities become complicit in its protection. Where fear and shame and complicity run so deep that families choose to forget their own missing children. Where a building on a hill continues to exist, continues to call to people, continues to do things that should be impossible. I don't know if that child's voice was real or a product of my terror-stricken mind. I don't know if the padlock was truly unlocked or if I opened it myself in some kind of fugue state. I don't know if the names on that church floor were real or chalk dust illusions created by fear and darkness. What I do know is this. Something is deeply, fundamentally wrong in Preacher is Hollow. Something old and patient and hungry. Something that has learned to hide in plain sight behind locked doors and sealed records and the terrible silence of people too afraid to speak. And if you ever find yourself driving through the Appalachian Mountains and your car breaks down near a small town you've never heard of, near a white church on a hill that seems to be watching you, I have one piece of advice. Fix your car and leave immediately. Don't ask questions. Don't investigate. Don't let curiosity pull you toward the darkness. Because some truths are too dangerous to uncover. Some horrors are meant to stay buried. And some places are called hollow for a reason. They are completely empty of mercy, empty of justice, and utterly full of fear. The preacher, his hollow church, is still standing, still waiting, still calling to people in the night. And I will never forget that it answered when I came looking for the truth. 10 stories, 10 pieces of evidence, 10 testimonies that the world tried to bury. Federal agents, 911 dispatchers, sheriffs, property managers, historians, railroad experts, paranormal investigators, ordinary people who just wanted answers and found something far, far worse. And every single one of them has the same warning. Dawn, to go looking for it. Dawn, to investigate. Dawn, to try to understand. But you know what? That warning doesn't to work anymore, because you've already heard these stories. You're already part of it now. The knowledge is in your mind. The images are burned into your memory. You can unhear the voice of that child singing in the darkness of the church basement. So here is what happens next. We're going to walk away from this video. We're going to try to sleep, and something is going to feel different. The shadows in your room will feel deeper. The silence will feel more present. Your dreams will be vivid in ways they haven't been before. And they'll come back to this channel again and again, because you need more. Because Vesper Shroud is the only place that tells you the truth about what exists in the darkness. But I need something from you first. Hit that subscribe button. Not later, right now. Lock into this channel, because next week, we're going deeper into Appalachia. We're going to expose what the government is hiding under those mountains. We're going to reveal the truth about what happened to those orphans. We're going to decode the symbols that are appearing in people's homes. Hit the notification bell. The second new video drops, YouTube needs to know you're the kind of viewer who can miss it. Because if you don't engage now, the algorithm will bury this, and the truth dies in darkness. Comment down below. Tell me which story broke you the most. Tell me which one you couldn't shake. Tell me where you were watching from. Because every comment you leave, every interaction you make, it tells me that you reawake, that you see what is happening, that you're not going to let these testimonies disappear into the void. And share this with someone you care about. Not to scare them, but because they need to know the truth. Because in a world full of comfortable lies, the truth is the most precious thing we have. The mountains are real. The darkness is real. And the thing that lives in the spaces between our world and theirs, it is watching. It's always watching. Thank you for making it through all 10 stories. Most people don't have the strength. Most people tap out. But you're still here. You're still listening. That either makes you the bravest person watching, or the most terrifyingly infected. Either way, welcome to Vesper Shroud. The darkness is only getting deeper from here.